Hello, I'm Peter Towers, Managing Director of ESS BIZTOOLS. Welcome to this webinar today, where we're going to look at the Australian government's budget that was announced last night and concentrate on evaluating it from a small medium enterprises point of view, because obviously that is the main area of concern for accountants who are advising SMEs. Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, can you please type them in and I will try to answer them. Some of them we may have to do some further research on. So I'm just going to go back to the PowerPoint slides and we'll get started. So we're looking at the budget for 22-23, which was presented by Josh Frydenberg, the Federal Treasurer, last night. Just a reminder that the budget needs to be passed by the Senate before it becomes law. And just how long the Senate process is going to take with an imminent election, I'm not sure. Let's look at the budget in review. The deficits are something we didn't think we'd see a few years ago, but obviously the country's had a lot of problems in the last couple of years with the campaign against COVID-19. So the forecast deficit in 22-23 is $78 billion. It's going to then go in a lower status over the next 3 years, 24, 56.5 billion, and down in 26, it's estimated to be worth $43.1 billion. The net debt at next year is going to be $714 billion. Unemployment is expected to be 3.75% in the 22-23, which is the lowest in 50 years. So that's great. It's great for the economy. And it's one of the reasons the overall net debt is not as high as what was forecast, even as recently as Christmas last year. The wages growth is forecast in 22-23 to be 2.75% and in 23-24 to be 3.25%. The inflation rate in the current year, or the next year, 22-23, at 4.25%, and the following year at 3%. So the government believes it can keep inflation under control. And at this stage, it would appear that the Reserve Bank is of the same opinion. Let's look at who were the beneficiaries. The newspapers have been full of it this morning. About $8.7 billion, they're saying, has been distributed. And the distribution is fairly wide. There's been a temporary cut in the fuel excise, which applies from last night, but retailers are going to have 2 weeks to fully implement it, and then the ACCC will be monitoring to make sure that the 50% reduction, which equates to 22.1%, has in fact been implemented into the cost of fuel. The one-off cost of living adjustment is $420 for people earning less than $126,000. This is going to be passed on by the PAYG system, so it applies from the 1st of July 22. There's a payment to pensioners, a one-off cash payment to pensioners of $250. And to quote the Treasurer, that will be paid in the next few weeks. And there's also a substantial reduction, in fact, $2.4 billion worth of subsidy for additional PBS medicines that's going to be phased in over the next 5 years. And I'm sure that's going to be welcomed by everyone who has to take some sort of medicine. So let's go through now and try to analyze what's happened from different people's points of view. So I've started this survey by looking at employees. Single parents can now access the full paid parental leave, which is 20 weeks. Couples who are married or living together, of course, can decide on what suits them to be able to claim the parental leave. They don't have to take it equally. There's a new apprenticeship scheme started where the apprentices receive $5,000 and the employer will be entitled to a grant of $15,000 for the employment of an apprentice. There's an apprenticeship scheme for women who wish to enter a trade that's listed in the National Apprenticeship Priority List. And the government is funding that $38 million over a 4-year period. And startup businesses will be able to offer an enhanced employee share scheme to their employees to get them to commit themselves to a long-term future with a startup business. That's great news. And I look forward to the full details being revealed as the government produces the legislation. Skills development and training. Skills development and training received quite a lot of discussion in the budget by the Treasurer. There's 800,000 new training places that's going to cost $3.7 billion. There's 120% tax deduction as long as you've spent more than $100 on external training to improve the skills of your team members. And there's a special aged care worker training program, which is going to have 15,000 potential participants in it, that the government's allocated $48.5 million to over 4 years to try to help this area where obviously there's been a lot of problems through COVID-19 and trying to build up the morale in that very important group of team members. The building and construction industries. First of all, home building is going to benefit by the home guarantee scheme to double. There's going to be 50,000 places available in it, and that will help the home building industry. This allows the first home buyers to enter the market with a 5% deposit, and a single parent is able to enter with a 2% deposit. And for both of those categories, without having to pay mortgage insurance, which is a big cost saving for them. The government is proposing to break up contracts into smaller components from government departments. It's instructed the government departments to look at breaking these contracts up so that SME businesses are able to tender for them. And one way they're trying to ensure this is that there will be no requirement for insurance until a contract has been awarded. You don't have to have your insurance in place when you submit your tender. It's when it's decided. The natural disaster support. Obviously, we're all aware of the huge problems in Southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales, and then in the Sydney metropolitan area, and then even south of Sydney, down around Nowra. The government has allocated a total of $6 billion for disaster relief. And there's also $665 million for businesses and farms for repairs to businesses, and $558 million for cleanup. Some of those activities will benefit small business because it will have been small business that suffered from the floods. But obviously, small business contractors might be able to secure some of this work because there's a lot of work to be done and there's a lot of money that's been allocated. The digital economy investment by small business will also be recognised. The government's offering a 120% deduction as long as $100 has been spent. And the activities, I'll just go back to this one. The activities are cloud computing, e-invoicing, cybersecurity, web design. So anything to do with digital economy will be able to be claimed as a tax deduction. The maximum that a business can spend on this whole category is $100,000 during the 12-month period. Manufacturing. The only item of manufacturing that I could find in the budget papers related to the commencement of vaccine production in Victoria with the federal government's assistance. And some of the other initiatives, of course, could also benefit manufacturing SME businesses. The environment, the Indigenous Rangers scheme is going to be extended. 1,000 new rangers will be employed, and this is for land and sea management. There is a recovery and conservation of koala habitats that is estimated to cost $53 million over 5 years. I assume that some of that money will be paid to private enterprise SMEs, and maybe this will give you an indication that some of your clients could be very interested in knowing that, so they can keep their eyes open for when the government calls for tenders. The Great Barrier Reef, an important asset for Australia. The government has allocated $1 billion for reef protection during the next 12 months. And I know that some of that work is undertaken by a whole range of private contractors, SME businesses. And $15 million has been allocated for the promotion of the reef, which is very important. The reef is a living asset, but it creates a lot of business activities. It attracts tourists, and then the tourists just can't walk to the reef. It's miles off the coast, and there's boats, there's accommodation, there's meals, there's a whole range of supply-orientated activities that are featured around the Barrier Reef, which runs for nearly 1,000 kilometres on the Queensland coast, of course. So it covers a big area and creates a lot of business activity. Businesses which have suffered over the last 2 years because of lack of international tourists and even Australian tourists because of the COVID problems. Let's look at war veterans. There's an expansion of the home care services that war veterans are eligible for. I know a fair bit about that. My mother receives that benefit, and it's a great scheme. It's been expanded for a further 37,000 veterans and their families. And there's also some extra funding for mental health schemes being incorporated within that. So that's very important. We might now go to the defence industry. And obviously events in Europe have made everyone take a lot more notice of defence. The government's announced an extra $38 billion allocated over the next 18 years. So the money's been reserved. They've got it so they can take it into their forward planning. But the government specifically announced that there's a new submarine base to be built somewhere on the East Coast. And I understand that the government's developing its final list from sites, including Brisbane, Newcastle, and Sydney. There's also a special allocation for cyber defence. The issues in Europe and have highlighted the need for greater cyber protection. And the government's allocating $9.9 billion to a section of the Defence Department to spearhead a response, not only by defence, but by the government and by business, to try to ensure that our cyber defences are at the highest level. The Department of Defence has also been asked by the government to package tenders in components of up to $500,000. And this is to encourage SMEs to bid for that work. The Defence Department has become very proactive looking at SMEs over the last few years. If you have a look at the government grants that are available, and we have a full program of those within ESS BIZ grants, which is part of ESS BIZTOOLS. And there's now a range of grants to help SME contractors to become familiar with the Defence Department requirements and to help them get their businesses so that they're very suitable for supplying services to Defence. This is going to be a growth area in the future, and it's one that a lot of SMEs could look at. So you could talk to your clients about that, especially if you're located anywhere near Defence areas. And they are spread around Australia because remember, they include Navy, Air Force and Army, and their facilities are located all around Australia. So your clients could be looking for submitting proposals for small components of what the Defence Department's looking for. Women. The government's created a pipeline, is the word they use it, for progress to board and leadership positions, including sporting coaches and managers. They've allocated $40 million for this over a few years to assist in running special courses and training programs to assist women who have the ability and desire to want to be on company boards of directors or even company board of advice, which is a great area for them to start. So if you've got any clients, ladies who are wanting to improve their corporate governance knowledge and skills, we have that material all contained within ESS BIZTOOLS, so you could supply that to them. But starting off as a board of advice member is a great way to get an understanding of how companies operate. And you should be able to help them in that area. $1.3 billion has been allocated to reduce domestic and sexual violence against women. I'm assuming that some of that money will be available for tender by SME businesses or medical practitioners. And that's the reason we've included this in our summary of the budget as it affects SMEs. The National Broadcasting Network is going to spend $480 million on upgrading the regional and remote wireless network for access to higher speed broadband. That will be very welcomed in country areas, remote areas, where accessing the broadband has been very difficult, if at all. And hopefully this expenditure of a large sum of money, $480 million, will fix those problems so that people operating businesses wherever they are located in Australia are able to communicate promptly and efficiently with their suppliers, their advisors, their accountants, their lawyers, contact their medical practitioners, undertake a whole range of services. I did some work last year for some medical specialists who were looking to expand some service provision that they were planning to implement into regional areas. And it was a real eye-opener to be going through with them and understanding the problems that medical practitioners, the GPs, the psychiatrists and psychologists that are on the ground in remote areas, or those people back in the regional or capital cities trying to service a medical facility so that advice can be given to patients in remote locations. It's very difficult. So hopefully this upgrade will assist in getting all of that fixed. Mental health and suicide prevention. This is a big problem, isn't it? The government's working towards zero suicides, but they're allocating $547 million to target initiatives at people, including young Australians, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people, multicultural communities. And again, some of this money, I'm sure, will be available to be tendered for by smaller medical practitioners and others to assist in this program. Infrastructure, a huge area, a massive amount on new projects, $18 billion, basically in unspecified projects at this stage that the government anticipates that they're going to approve. And this is part of an overall pipeline which totals $120 billion over the next 10 years. The government is also budgeting for the commencement of major dam construction. This hasn't happened for 30 odd years. And I think in a dry country like ours, we have got to improve our water supply. And we've also got to create the dams so that the rivers don't cause the problems that they're causing from flooding. It might mean there's more dams required in some areas. The major dam is called Hell's Gate, which is to be built on the northern parts of the Burdekin River in North Queensland. This is a massive project, $5.4 billion. It's taken nearly 90 years to come to fruition because the gentleman who designed the Sydney Harbour Bridge, Bradfield, originally designed this dam. And it's this very location 90 years ago. So it's all coming to fruition. Agriculture. There's an expansion of the patent box scheme for the agricultural industry. This was a scheme that the government started last year for Australian medical and biotech inventions. So the concept is if you're undertaking something, or you've got clients undertaking projects in the agricultural industry that are going to contribute to the lowering of carbon emissions, and the patent has been registered in Australia. I should have said, first of all, the research and development has been conducted in Australia. The patent has then been registered in Australia. That company will only have to pay income tax at 17% instead of the normal tax rate. So that's a significant benefit. It's the same basis as what is already in operation for the medical and biotech industries. So this is all starting as from last night and will apply to the income years about to start. Asset write-off. There's no mention about any sort of extension of the asset write-off scheme, which expires on the 30th of June 23. That was the implementation of that asset write-off scheme. I think you could basically assume that that will not be extended, but probably just note at this stage that there was no comment made one way or the other. Superannuation. The government has halved the superannuation drawdown rate for self-funded retirees. And this has been, this is going to be extended for 12 months. So the halving they've agreed to, that's a continuation actually. And it's going to can continue for a further 12 months if your client wishes to do that. It's also worth noting there was no mention of any new taxes on superannuation in the budget. Tourism. Tourism has obviously suffered a lot of problems from COVID-19, and funding for the recovery of tourism has been allocated $146 million over the next 3 years. net migration. I think one of the real lessons we have learnt in the last 2 years is that the lack of these people, backpackers, students and skilled workers, really has an effect on the Australian economy. Backpackers, because a lot of them have participated in working primarily in rural industries. They were encouraged to go there, of course. And one of the consequences of their unavailability has been ever increasing prices of food, obviously fruit and vegetables, because farmers are having great difficulty in finding people to pick their produce, which is very sad, but that's the reality. Students, because they pay a lot of money to universities and to accommodation providers and to restaurants and cafes and bars. And they're also good tourist travelers around the country to have a look at what's going on. So they make a big contribution and they haven't been here. So it's great to see that the government really wants them back. And I've been reading that the aircraft that are now flying into Australia have got many students on them. And skilled workers. Now, there's a couple of different figures quoted on skilled workers, but it would appear that the government's anticipating 109,000 people arriving in Australia in the next 12 months who are skilled under the various skilled worker programs. And again, some people might have been skeptical prior to 2 years ago as to whether these numbers were really necessary, but I think we all found out that they were, because a lot of businesses, some and SMEs were looking for staff and couldn't get staff. And this might have been part of the problem. So the government's expecting the migration to pick back up. The National Disability Insurance Scheme, a lot of this is obviously serviced by SME businesses. Personally, I'm amazed at the number of businesses that are out there now supplying services under the NDIS. And I think they'd be interested to know that the government has continued the funding. In fact, the Treasurer made a specific comment last night that the funding will continue. It is fully funded. And a note that I found somewhere is that by 24-25, the NDIS funding will be more than the defence industry. So that is a lot of money. And there's obviously a lot of people that needed that assistance. Disadvantaged young people. This is a program that the federal government's initiating. It's targeted at 5,000 people for the creation of a pre-employment program. People will be aged 15 to 24, and the government has allocated $53 million over 5 years. Again, there are components of this program that some of your SME clients may be interested in tendering to supply those services. I know a young chap who has been supplying services along one of these sort of programs in Queensland, going into a facility. So there's plenty of people, self-employed SMEs, who are supplying these types of services. So if you have those people as clients, you could mention this to them, that there is a pre-employment program. The papers don't indicate where it's going to be located or if it's going to be spread out. I hope it's spread out, but we will have to wait and see. Commercialization of technology. The government is proposing corporate tax breaks for commercializing technologies that lower emissions. The government already has the Accelerating Commercialization Grant Program, but this initiative is obviously targeted at someone who's specifically wanting to commercialize technologies that will lower emissions. So that's really tailoring what the government's trying to achieve, and it's up to businesses, SMEs, to decide whether they can meet those guidelines, because the government is going to provide funds for that. They've allocated $30 million over 4 years. So it's worth having a look at if you've got clients who are involved in that type of activity in the development of technologies which might be able to lower emissions. SME cash flow. Couple of interesting items from the government. First of all, the government is going to speed up the payment of invoices from SMEs. Now, they've tried this a couple of times, and generally I think the federal government has improved payment times ever since we received that disastrous award about 3 or 4 years ago now, whereby Australia was recognised by an international committee of having the longest debtors days outstanding in the world. I think it's a national disgrace. Unfortunately, when I look at figures, I wouldn't be surprised we've still got that record. But the government, to give them their due, the federal government did issue some instructions about 3 years ago after pressure from the small business ombudsman to Kate Carnell, was then the ombudsman, put pressure on the government to get government departments to speed up their payments. This latest instruction that's going out from the federal government is that electronic invoices are to be paid within 5 days. 5 days. I hope that happens. And other invoices must be paid within 20 days. Now, it doesn't say whether this is business days or work days, but either way, it's very good on what was happening a few years ago. And if they don't pay within that time frame, the SME can charge them interest. I hope the government's going to be monitoring this to make sure there's no victimisation delivered at any SME that claims that interest, because that would be very unfortunate, and I'm sure that would not be the intention of the government. The second item, which has had a bit of publicity, is that the government proposes to change the PAYG tax calculations so that the uplift rate will be 2% rather than 10%. And I did read a report a week or so ago as to what the saving for SMEs was going to be from this change, and it was nearly $1 billion, according to the government department that released that, which is probably the tax office, or it might have been Treasury. I'm not sure who it was, but it's a significant amount of money that will be saved by businesses because of the reduction in the amount of PAYG tax that we will all be paying for our employees. That's my run through on the items that I picked out of last night's budget relating to the federal budget as presented by Josh Frydenberg. Last night I had the pleasure of being part of the Westpac Bank presentation by joining them on the internet, of course, and listening to their chief economist, Bill Evans, who made a very interesting presentation. I was still awake at the end of his presentation. I hope everyone else was. And it just shows you an economist talking for an hour. He threw a bit of humor into it, threw some interesting comments, and made it a very interesting presentation. So it was well done. And some of the information that I've used today was extracted from Mr. Evans's presentation. So what do you do with this now? If you're a subscriber to ESS BIZTOOLS, obviously you can download your Business Plus for the federal budget, because we uploaded that at 12 noon AEST, about 5 minutes before we started this webinar. Actually, it was uploaded. So please go onto the ESS BIZTOOLS website as a subscriber, download the document, remove the ESS branding, which is only on the front page and on the last page, and replace it with your own, and it's then ready to go to your clients and prospects. And hopefully you get some reaction from your clients. But I think you then need to have an action plan. What are you then going to do? This document that I've just been through is based on what we have in the newsletter. The newsletter, of course, has more information on the various items. I think you should have a good close look at what we have in Business Plus and say to yourself, which of your clients could be interested in these items, and alert them that they're there. Give them a ring or send them an email and saying, oh, have you noticed this? Or I thought this might suit you, just to let them know that you're aware of them and that you're there to assist them if they need your assistance in getting anything ready. And obviously some of the training activities, they may want to get started in that as soon as possible. Obviously, none of this is law until it is passed by the Senate, although I did see an interesting article in the Financial Review last night, which quoted the opposition leader as saying that even if there was a change of government, the Labor Party would implement the current government's budget. And so these activities should be able to be claimed on as they are phased in by the legislation. I'm just checking to see whether I've got any questions. I can't see that I've got any. So thank you for being with us. And if you're watching this later on, you never come to the live presentation, that's okay. But if you're watching it later on and you have any questions, you'll have to send me an email, peter@essbiztools.com.au. Thank you for your support of ESS BizTools and ESS BizGrants. Thank you for being with us today. Stay safe and have a great day. Thank you. Thank you for your support. Goodbye.